Hello, and thank you for joining us for the TAA webinar, Tips and Techniques for Enhancing Your Approach to Visuals, presented by Beth Ann Merkel. Beth Ann is an independent researcher, writer, illustrator, and consultant. She is an award-winning artist and communicator fascinated with science and sustainability. She is particularly passionate about teaching researchers, teachers, and the public how to incorporate drawing into work and lifestyle. She leads workshops on sketching for scientists and science communication skills for entities such as Harvard Forest, the University of Wyoming, and the Ecological Society of America. Her work can be seen in numerous publications, including American Scientist, Montana Outdoors, and the Journal of Agricultural, Food Systems, and Community Development. She embraces visual communication projects such as photography commissions from Parks Canada and illustration and editing for academics working on projects as wide-ranging as Indigenous food sovereignty and bighorn sheep conservation. Hello, Beth Ann. Thank you for joining us today.
So thank you all for inviting me to speak with you about illustration. I've been working at the intersection of science communication, art, and education for about a decade. This work has been inspiring and challenging, and many of the challenges can be smoothed out by better understanding what illustration can communicate and contribute to communication efforts. So I'm excited to share some of what I've learned with you today. My specialty is ecology, natural subjects, teaching scientists to draw, and so on. So the examples you'll see today draw from that focus. Don't worry though, what we're going to discuss today is generally relevant to illustrations in any field. This is because, first of all, most humans think in images. Our brains actually understand images faster and remember images longer than words. And approximately 70% of the receptors in our brain respond to visual stimuli. As a result, your image choices are fundamental to communicating the significance of your research or the information you want your students to understand, and illustrations can be a powerful choice. Now, I'm not an advocate for drawing just because I'm an illustrator and art science integration consultant. So let's ask a question. Why not just use a photo? Illustrations can do some things that photos can't. An illustration can highlight key features and combine elements, creating an accurate representation by showing multiple angles or cross-sections, and so on. Photographs usually cannot do this without being heavily manipulated, without essentially being turned into illustrations. Illustrations can also capture rare and fleeting moments that might require professional-level photography skills and equipment, or might just not be capturable at all. Furthermore, illustrations think like the human brain. Recent neurological research indicates the human mind-eye combination does not function as a neutral camera like we'd expect. Rather, the brain actively seeks outlines, and thus, drawings may correspond more closely with what the brain sees than the light that photographs represent. And importantly, illustrations can generate an emotive connection. A fair body of research tells us that making affective, emotional connections is not just a compelling, but an essential way of helping learners connect prior experiences to new information. And this sort of affective connection is particularly important if the learning you are facilitating may contradict a student or a reader's prior knowledge. But I'm not an artist. I can't draw. That's what I usually hear when I encourage folks to use drawings in their publications, presentations, research, and teaching. But that's okay, because first of all, most humans, by the time we're 2, have the motor skills and hand-eye coordination necessary to hold a pencil and make marks. And drawing is the earliest form of documentation or visual communication that people invented. So we have a pretty solid history of drawing. And notably, drawing as we think of it today, photorealistic, seemingly three-dimensional, that kind of drawing is a skill set that took artists, architects, scientists, and mathematicians in the Middle East and Europe over 400 years to develop. As an accomplished and prolific bird illustrator and drawing instructor, Jaromir Laws puts it this way: if you think you can't draw, think again. You're no more born an artist than a chef or a mechanic. Unfortunately for us, drawing is a skill set that can be taught and can be learned and can be practiced. Also, importantly, creativity is not an inherited gift. It's a misunderstood noun. It is not what artists have and scientists lack. Rather, creativity is the ability to make new things or think of new ideas, which most of us do fairly often, actually. So, let's take this awareness of how drawings can be valuable communication tools and our inherent potential to create drawings ourselves and think, what's the last thing that you drew? And what are your concerns related to using illustrations in your own publications and presentations? You take about a minute to note down what first comes to mind. I'll start the timer, and I'll let you know when it's time to wrap up and move on. Okay, so take your minute. You have about 30 seconds left. Five seconds. Okay, so let's use the webinar chat function to share. What were your responses to those previous questions? Take just a moment and toss those in there. Okay, and when we get to the end, we'll take a minute and we'll try to see what we notice about other folks' drawings and what folks might worry about, who has similar responses, that kind of thing. Something that I notice often when folks respond to a question like this is that we do a lot more drawing than we think we do. And in particular, a lot of things that we do that are drawings, we don't think of as drawings. We might draw a map for someone who's visiting us and navigating our town. We might sketch out a diagram for a construction or a craft project. We might lay out a sequence of boxes that organize ideas into a bit of a visual diagram or a thought cloud or something like that. And all of those things are ways of thinking visually. So, yeah, the bottom line point is that often we do more drawing than we give ourselves credit for. Okay. So let's rally and focus on how we can actually generate our own illustrations. We're going to try two shortcuts, and the first is tracing. Now there are a couple of ways to do this. First, if you have a specific scene or place or object that you want to take a picture of, or you could obtain a picture of it, or you can make sure that you have permission to adapt or reproduce a particular image. So for today's purposes, as we mentioned in an email yesterday and in the notes before the webinar started, just grab a magazine or some other disposable visual, and you'll also ideally have a thick black marker, although a pen or a colored marker would do. So what we'll do is draw right on top of the picture. But your task is to see how few lines you can use to capture the essence of the image. If you are creating an illustration for your own purposes, you first print or photocopy the picture that you're working with several times. So go ahead and draw as I'm speaking and work your way through this, and I'll keep giving you a few more details as we go. So what you'll do then is trace over your focal image, and if this is an image that you are practicing drawing, you might do this several times. And those multiple copies that you have will enable you to experiment until you come up with a version of that line work that you like. You can then use a blank piece of paper and copy onto it the lines that you've created by tracing the picture. You would also do that by actually laying your blank piece of paper over top, arranging for some light behind it with a tracing pad or holding it up to a window, something like that. What you're doing in an exercise like this is creating a habit in your mind, enabling you to quickly reduce the complexity of a scene to lines essential for representing it. Go ahead and keep sketching. And I'm going to mention one really important thing to keep in mind when you're creating illustrations. That is, the pictures that you draw from are already the intellectual property of the person who took that photograph. So, apart from personal private practice, if you're going to copy a picture, you need to have permission to do so. The easiest way to ensure you have permission is to draw from your own photographs, of course. But if you don't have the right photo yourself, you can look for public domain images on Google, Flickr, or Wikimedia Commons. And this searching out of a resource or reference image that you can draw from is the same process that an illustrator uses to identify images they can legally copy, learn from, or repurpose. You can achieve similar skill development by using transparency sheets like we used to use on overhead projectors, or even something like plexiglass. And in this case, you'll use a black wet erase marker, first to ensure your lines don't smudge, and second, so that you can reuse that clear surface. You might even use a window if you have one handy. So try it for just a second if you have any of these materials available. Hold up the clear surface to a window, a scene, or an object, and trace away. And you'll see that you can quickly get your line and your hand and your eye to collaborate and simplify something very complicated down to some basic line work. Now, the bonus of using these clear surfaces is that they're readily photocopied or scanned. And when you scan or photocopy your sketch, you immediately have a black and white drawing that can be used as a diagram. It could also be used as the foundation for a more complicated drawing, or maybe you're going to use it as a worksheet or a coloring page. I'm going to give you another minute to finish up on either one of those kinds of sketches. So I'll start the timer and I'll let you know when the time runs out. You have about 30 seconds left. Ten seconds. All right. Pause where we're at. The beautiful thing about drawing is we can usually come back to it. So, speaking of scanning or other ways of reproducing images, I'd like to offer a couple of suggestions about how to make digitizing your drawings a bit less work. First, consider your tools. Use a soft pencil, a black pen, or a black marker. These dark mark-making tools show up a lot better when scanned versus tools that make lighter marks like a very hard graphite pencil. And we also want to make sure we use white paper because it requires a lot less color adjustment once it's been scanned. Secondly, set your settings so that you're scanning in color, not in grayscale. Even if you're scanning a black and white drawing, the color mode captures more information, and you can adjust your image to be black and white later when you're processing it. You also want to scan at least 300 dpi. 300 to 600 is pretty reasonable depending on what you're producing. You need your image to be at least 300 dpi when its height or its width is 5 inches. Lower dpi than that equates to low resolution images that don't reproduce well in print or when they're enlarged. There's plenty more to consider if you're scanning sketches and illustrations made in color, but that's probably for another training session. Okay, so let's say you're going to work on your own sketches, but in the meantime, you need an illustrator. A productive way to think of the experience, the relationship of working with an illustrator, is to start by conceptualizing it as a collaboration. Involve the illustrator as early as possible in the project so that you both have an opportunity to contribute ideas and ask questions and things like that. Additionally, engaging an illustrator should entail a commitment on your part as well as the illustrator's. We'll get more into the importance of formalizing that commitment in a moment. Essentially, though, both collaboration and commitment necessarily involve communication, which will be essential for a productive illustration experience for you both. And what about that fourth C? Well, all creative work done in the United States is automatically copyrighted upon creation. Rules vary by country elsewhere, so plan to look into that if you commission illustration abroad. Here in the US, though, our laws mean that the illustrator owns the copyrights to all their own work, even if you're paying them to do it. That is, unless you negotiate to buy those rights from them. And we'll get into that option in a little bit more detail later on. Now, even though the illustrator holds the copyrights, it's important to recognize that you're probably in a position of greater power and advantage than the illustrator you're hiring or contracting or commissioning. After all, you're probably the one with the money and with the institution or publisher behind you. And so it's your responsibility to do everything you can to ensure the experience is mutually fair and beneficial. So let's have a look at how we do this. Above all, please do not ask illustrators to submit design ideas to you directly or by a contest or anything else that involves uncompensated use of their professional skill set. That's called spec work or speculative work. In order to keep doing the work that we want to hire them to do, illustrators need to be paid fairly. Just like we expect to pay professionals like a plumber or an eye doctor or a piano teacher or a copy editor or an architect, a professional illustrator should be compensated for all their time and ideas. Furthermore, you'll want to avoid speculative websites because those are spots where people try to outbid each other by bidding for lower and lower fees. And although you might not have to spend much the first time around, you're unlikely to receive the quality of illustrations you're looking for. This is because people dependent on spec work must generate many illustrations in short periods of time in order to make even a semblance of a living. This is often only possible by recycling, borrowing, using clip art, etc. This all means you won't get great illustrations, and they won't get a living wage. And so the bottom line is that spec work isn't really fair to you, and it's not fair to the illustrator either. So, as you get ready for an illustration project, here are some of the things that you'll want to consider. Developing some kind of contract or written agreement, knowing what you want, knowing how much time you have, and knowing what you can spend. Let's break these down a bit. Whether you call it a contract, an MOU, a purchase order, or an agreement, contracts are critical, and fair contracts are essential. They ensure that everyone involved with the project knows what the goals and terms are, what each party's responsibilities are, who pays who, how much, and when, how and when the contracts can end, and so on. Writing a fair contract is essential if you want to have a fully productive and mutually beneficial relationship with an illustrator. And writing a fair contract is essential if you want great drawings that are made by someone who's earning a fair income from contributing their professional expertise to your project. So how do we write a fair to generous contract? Well, to start with, insist on something in writing, even if it's just an email that encompasses all the project considerations and to which all parties state in writing that they agree. At a minimum, this contract should address the following. Who's responsible for what? Deadlines. How communication will take place. Who makes decisions and can request or require revisions. What the compensation will be. How expanded scope or excessive revisions, which is more than 1 or 2 rounds of revisions, how that will be negotiated. Licensing terms. And terms for terminating the agreement or project, including kill fees, which are the amount of money you'll pay the illustrator if the project is canceled at various stages once it's already underway. A potentially challenging element of contracts is the nature of your institution's purchasing policies. And I can tell you from experience that clients who already know their institution's procurement policies are far, far easier to work with. Here's a couple of the things that you should try to know in advance. What are the purchasing thresholds that trigger requirements such as someone other than you needing to sign terms of an agreement, or requiring a legal review of an agreement, or requiring the illustrator to carry contractor's insurance and things like that? Thresholds like these might be triggered at, say, $1,500, $2,500, $10,000. You'll want to aim for the lowest level of institutional oversight possible while ensuring the illustrator is still receiving fair compensation. If necessary and possible, you might wind up breaking a project into smaller units so that you can retain more control over the terms of your agreement. And again, from experience, I can tell you it's not financially feasible or really ethically fair for an illustrator to be expected to carry millions of dollars of liability insurance along with signing a contract that requires the illustrator to assume all liability and give away copyrights. For an example, that's equivalent roughly to requiring an architect to carry liability insurance for a campus building design, but also expecting the architect to be forever liable for future renovations made by different companies, and also expecting that same first architect to agree to receive no credit for their designs and to not use any of the ideas, materials, or tools that they used for that design anywhere else. It doesn't quite work. And the way a lot of institutions' procurement policies are set up, they're not thinking about small, probably not even in the same physical space as you, projects like illustration. They tend to be thinking about ladders falling and walls collapsing. And so it's really, really valuable if you can be a little bit ahead of that for your illustrator. So in essence, we want to try to organize projects so that procurement policies and associated contract terms are not onerous or impossible for the illustrator to meet. Otherwise, you'll have a hard time finding someone who could work with you. And on a related note, it's crucial that you plan on dealing with your own institution when it comes to procurement and any associated paperwork. It's not really the illustrator's responsibility, and it's not even really appropriate for the illustrator to deal directly with your institution about your project. Do be sure, though, to aim for mutually beneficial terms, and do think of this whole process as a negotiation. Both you and the illustrator need to be satisfied with the terms before starting work on the project. So let's take a look at some other important elements of planning an illustration project. Before you approach the illustrator and ask if they're interested in working with you, do a bit of homework. Above all, verify that the illustrator you intend to approach does the kind of illustration work that you want. That might seem obvious, but for example, it's not a great idea to ask someone to do digital animation if they've never done it before. Because even if they agree, there will be a huge learning curve on their end, which means a lot of waiting on your end, plus no guarantee the final image will be as polished as you had hoped. And if you're not certain about someone's experience or professionalism, you could ask them if they're willing to provide examples of past work, or to put you in touch with previous clients. But don't expect them to do this, because most illustrators will already have information they're able or willing to share posted on their websites, and they might expect you've already looked at it. You will also want to do some thinking about your illustration needs in advance. At least have a rough idea of what you need illustrated. If possible, have ready a list of the exact illustrations you need, or a detailed description of the material you need illustrated if you're going to collaborate with the illustrator to develop an illustration list. If possible, pull together some examples of illustrations you like, or of projects like the one you have in mind. Know what you do and don't like about these examples and be ready to explain that. This will save a lot of time as the illustrator won't have to guess what it is that you have in mind. Be aware, however, that some kinds of projects, like logos, will involve several to many iterations as you and the illustrator together refine your ideas into something visible. And you should expect to budget for that sort of iterative work. Additionally, have reference images in mind for your specific illustrations if you can, or even better, have them ready in a folder or a document or somewhere that's easy to share. And be sure, like we were talking earlier, that these reference images are ones you have taken or have permission to reproduce or make derivative images from. Otherwise, you'll need to anticipate that the illustrator will need to charge you for the time necessary to identify or take those reference images themselves. You'll also want to know your timeline and be candid about it from the outset. There's that old adage, right, about good, fast, and cheap. And in illustration, it's certainly true that you can't have all three. If you're on a tight deadline, you're going to anticipate paying more for your illustrations. And you also may need to consider that you might agree on less detail, less color, and so on, in order for the illustrator to produce quality images within your time constraints. Similarly, the tighter your deadline, the more responsive you'll need to be to any questions, concerns, and drafts that the illustrator sends your way. Certainly, delays on your part can't be held against the illustrator. You also need to know how you'll be using the illustrations. Most of the time, you'll only need reproduction licenses, and this means you'll be paying for the right to use the illustration in a particular way, say in a publication, on a website, in an educational display, or even on a t-shirt. Knowing up front how you intend to reproduce the images is an essential part of how the illustrator prices their work. For example, if you're Nike and you're going to be reproducing the illustration in an ad in the New York Times, then that illustration is worth a lot of money to both the illustrator and Nike, and so Nike should be prepared to spend plenty on it. Similarly, you should be prepared to spend considerably more money if you want exclusive rights, which means no one else, including the illustrator, could reproduce the images, or if you want full copyrights, which means in addition to all the rights, you also have access to the idea of it. For a full copyrights buyout, for example, you could spend double or more than what you just would for reproduction licenses. You also want to know how flexible you can be and be candid about that. Perhaps you're in a position to help a new illustrator gain experience. Maybe you'll take on a graphic design intern through a collaboration with the art department, for example. But be sure you weigh whether you can afford to help that person gain that experience. You'll need to be patient and extremely communicative if you decide to work with a novice illustrator. Detailed project agreements are particularly important in these cases, and it's also important that you still plan to compensate the illustrator fairly. Of course, you can get creative, but don't take advantage of novice illustrators. And finally, know how much you can spend and be candid about it as soon as possible. Talking about money is one of the least pleasant aspects of being an illustrator, and it's not. It's not because we never have enough or we're trying to take all of yours. It's because we often work with people who have never before commissioned this kind of work and are therefore unfamiliar and uncomfortable with how to budget for and talk about how much illustration costs. First of all, if you have the final word on the budget, at least make sure you're authorized to solicit an estimate. Secondly, know that any entrepreneur who's self-employed, freelance, however they describe themselves, entrepreneurs in pretty much any field need to make roughly $65 an hour in order to account for all the benefits and expenses and taxes that are usually rolled up into payroll if they're working as an employee. So you can see that illustration is an investment, and you should be willing to plan for that if you're being fair to your illustrator. So the third thing is knowing how much you can spend on illustrations is invaluable for an illustrator preparing a project estimate for you because it enables the illustrator to be candid and realistic about what is possible within your budget. For example, if you tell me you only have $500 to spend and you detail your project, I can tell you how much of that project or at what level of complexity I could agree to complete it. If you tell me you have $10,000, we're going to have actually a fairly similar conversation, but you'll get probably more detail, more color, maybe more drawings, possibly more generous licensing terms, or maybe you're paying more because you need these drawings done really quickly. If you can't tell me how much you can spend, I'll have to take your project description, draft an estimate, and then hope that I don't scare you off with a fair and realistic projection of time, anticipated revisions, creative input, and therefore total estimated project cost. It's much easier for me to help you figure out what's feasible if I know what kind of budget you're dealing with. And trust me, we illustrators are practice problem solvers, and we really don't want to run you off. All right, let's review. Images are important because humans are visual thinkers. Illustrations can be powerful communication tools. We can make our own illustrations. And we can also collaborate with professional illustrators, keeping a few important considerations in mind. We need to have a commitment to mutually beneficial project terms. There's lots of communication and planning involved. And we're definitely going to have to talk about and plan for time and money. But, as we've been discussing, illustrations can definitely be worth the effort. Of course, I'm the illustrator, so you might think it's easy for me to say so, but hopefully in today's conversation we've also seen that being on the illustrator side of things is complicated, potentially risky, and certainly plenty of work, just like it is for the people hiring illustrators. Of course, as we've discussed today, if we commit to mutually beneficial project terms, we have the potential to create powerfully compelling visuals that help communicate your message. And that's my favorite part of being an illustrator, actually. Knowing that my skills can help make important ideas and information more accessible. And that's why I hope the big message you take home today is that we're in this together. So let's close with one last point of reflection. Take just a moment and write about something specific you learned today that makes using illustrations in your work seem more feasible. And also make note of how and why did this information help. I'll start the timer, we'll take just a minute, and then we'll open the floor for questions. Okay, 30 seconds. All right, time's up. Over to you, Becky.
All right, thank you, Beth Ann, for that excellent advice on enhancing visuals. We'll now take some time for questions. Please type your question into the question box on your screen. I'll be sharing your questions in order that they are received. If you would like, I would encourage you to also share the answer to the last question that Beth Ann asked. All right, so let me pull up the questions. So, Beth Ann, there was one question from the first interactive activity. Somebody asked, is there a tool that uses a mirror to when you were talking about the tracing the images? Do you know?
Not off the top of my head, but it sounds like the kind of thing that probably somebody cooked up in the Renaissance, which means that probably there's something like it still around, essentially where you could have the mirror reflect an image onto your paper and then kind of trace directly onto your paper. I'm guessing that's more or less what we're talking about. And if you have transparency sheets, you can essentially do the same thing by just putting the transparency over your image. That's probably the limit of what I should say without looking it up.
Okay, thank you. So I just wanted to go over a couple of things. Here are some of the answers to the very first question asked early on. I believe it was, what was the last thing that you drew? So one of the answers was, the last thing I drew was a beaker on the board during a class discussion, a sketch in my journal. One person said that they haven't drawn for a long time. And then another person said the last thing that they drew was hearts and happy faces on Valentine's Day.
There you go. There's actually some really cool research documenting that doodling, even if you're not doodling the content material of what you're listening to, can help you focus better on something that someone's saying and can help you remember it better. So don't underestimate the power of some hearts and emojis.
Okay, so we've got quite a few questions here coming in. Here's one. How or where to find ideas for the illustrations in the link with my teaching? That link with my teaching.
Can we be more specific about what kind of teaching you do? That might give me more ideas.
Sure. So if the person who asked the question, if you could just write in a little bit more information, then we'll come back to that one. Give her a minute. And the next question, I would like to know more about your creative process and the choices that you make.
So briefly, there's actually a fair amount about it on my website. So if this kind of illustration is something that's of interest to you, we can deep dive over there. But one thing that's specific about my process is that I usually draw from real life. I'm not very good at making things up. And that might be because I've focused most of my career on drawing real life things. And it might just be the way my brain and my training have worked in the past. But that's part of it. And then another part of process that's really important for me is the tools that I use. I really like watercolor and pen and ink. And I do some digital work as well, but most of the time, even if I'm doing digital drawings, I'm trying to make them look like watercolor style sketches.
Okay, thank you. Back to the last question, she responded that she teaches in accounting.
Oh, interesting. Okay. I think probably what you'd want to do is put in a search phrase relevant to the kind of material you're teaching, and then also include in it Creative Commons or public domain. And you could try searching on Google or Flickr or Instagram. You might even try Wikipedia and the Library of Congress for maybe more old-fashioned style illustrations. But if you specifically look for stuff that's Creative Commons, there's a set of licenses, and a lot of times if it's a Creative Commons license, someone's saying you can reproduce this image, but you need to have my name on it, or you can reproduce this image and link back to it, or you can reproduce it for free as long as you're doing something for free with it. And then public domain images, essentially nobody owns them anymore. So they're up for grabs to use for about anything that you want.
Okay, and I have another question here that kind of goes with that last question. This question is, does a drawing that's based on a photo, not traced from a photo, also require copyright permission from the photographer?
Yes, it does. If we just look at an image and draw from it, we're essentially copying it. We're essentially copying all the visual information or idea that's in it. And that's what's called making a derivative work. And copyright laws for educational and private non-commercial use usually allow you to practice that kind of drawing, but they don't allow you to do anything public with that drawing. So your best bet is to come up with images where you already know you have the right to use it, or sometimes I've done this. I find an image online and it's pretty much exactly the reference that I need, say for a posture of a snowshoe hare or something. And I will dig around until I can figure out who took the photograph and then email them and ask them, say, here's what I'm using this image for. Do you mind if I use it? And so far, everyone I've contacted has said yes. Might depend on what your usage is. They might expect to be compensated if that image is going into a book that you're going to make money off of, for example.
Okay, thank you very much. Looks like we have just one question. I'll go ahead and just send one reminder out there. If anybody else has a question they would like answered, you can write that in now. If not, then I'll read this last one. Can you recommend a book or source for information on cognitive role of drawing or drawing in the brain and learning?
Ooh. Books? Most of the reading that I've done on this has been in the academic literature. And so what I'm actually going to do is, shameless plug here, over on my blog just about a month ago, I posted an article where I had compiled a whole bunch of information on this cognition and learning and memory related to drawing. And the blog post is suggestions for integrating drawing into university level biology courses. But a lot of the information that's in there is relevant to anyone. So I'm going to see if I can send this link to Becky and maybe she can copy it over so that you can see it. And as for books, I haven't come up with a lot that are really specific to cognition. So if you come up with one, I'd love to read it.
Okay. So I have one more question, and then there is a comment, and I believe it's a comment in regards to the last question. So I'm just confirming that with her. It looks like there's two questions here. So what drawing software do you use?
I use the Adobe Suite. There are some free programs. There's one online, and I think you actually use it online, called GIMP, G-I-M-P. And it's essentially the same as Photoshop, more or less. And then I use a Wacom tablet, and I have probably like the very first version they ever came out with back in the 90s or whatever it was. So, but that's also works just great for me because, like I said, my style is pretty simple, sketchy, classic. If I was doing a lot more complicated 3D rendering, I would probably need to update my stuff a bit.
Okay, and then I just wanted to also add in for the question about can you recommend a book or source for information on cognitive role of drawing or drawing in the brain and learning. Another member actually suggested a book called Drawing on Both Sides of the Brain. So I just wanted to, we can check that out after the webinar, but I thought I would mention it because she wrote that here. And then it looks like we just have time for one more question, so I will ask this final question. Beth Ann, could you please share the academic references and or your blog site?
Yes, so I just sent Becky a link to the specific blog article I was mentioning that had a lot of research linked throughout it. And then my website itself is commnatural.com. So that's C-O-M-M, like communication, COMMNATURAL.com.
All right, great. And we'll get that link put on to the information for the webinar, the recording. So I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Beth Ann, for sharing your expertise with us today. Again, thank you very much, Beth Ann, for sharing your expertise with us today. Thank you all for participating in today's webinar.